The mail still sat on the porch 3 days later, an unopened stack of suburban normalcy, junk mail, bills, a catalog, silently marking the unusual stillness inside the modest ranch house on Rosemont Drive in Guilderland, New York. It was early October, the maple trees along the street just beginning to turn scarlet and gold, casting long, gentle shadows across manicured lawns. On a street where lives typically unfolded with quiet predictability, this small detail, the neglected mail, was a subtle disruption, the first faint signal that the routine had been permanently broken. Inside number 17, the air was still, the furniture undisturbed, a scene set for everyday life, abruptly paused. The quiet was surgical, absolute, a stark contrast to the vibrant world outside, where children were at school and neighbors were embarking on their morning routines. The house itself was unremarkable, painted a neutral gray, with neatly trimmed hedges, and a small well-tended flower bed by the front door, a picture of suburban peace that now felt like a carefully constructed facade. It was just past noon when concern prompted a call that would shatter this tranquility. A colleague, receiving no response after repeated attempts to reach Linda Perry, had contacted her husband, who was away on business. He, in turn, had asked a neighbor to check on her. What the neighbor found upon entering was not the flu, or a forgotten phone, but an unnatural quiet and a scene that would soon draw yellow tape and uniformed officers to Rosemont Drive. The front door had been unlocked, a detail that would later become significant, suggesting either familiarity or a lack of perceived threat. The interior was neat, almost unnervingly so, no signs of struggle immediately apparent in the living room or kitchen. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, amplifying the silence. It was in the master bedroom that the full scope of the stillness became horrifyingly clear. Linda Perry was found lying on the floor beside the bed. There was no visible sign of forced entry, no ransacking of the house, nothing to suggest a robbery or a random intruder. The scene was perplexing, defying the typical characteristics of violent crime. Uniformed officers arrived first, their initial reports sparse, noting only the presence of the deceased and the seemingly undisturbed nature of the residence. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. The medical examiner was notified, initiating the methodical clinical process of understanding the precise moment life had ceased in this quiet house. Detectives from the Guilderland Police Department arrived shortly thereafter, their approach deliberate, their expressions grim as they stepped across the threshold, entering a domestic space transformed into a crime scene. The initial walkthrough was cautious, eyes scanning every detail, the placement of objects, the lack of disarray, the position of the body. The house held its secrets close, a silent witness to the events that had transpired within its walls. The mail on the porch remained untouched, a silent, mundane sentinel to the quiet horror discovered inside. The street remained outwardly calm, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded behind one of its ordinary doors, a tragedy that would soon reveal a hidden life beneath the suburban veneer. The initial investigation unfolded with methodical precision. Detectives established a perimeter, preserving the scene for forensic examination. Crime scene analysts arrived, their equipment bags laid out on the manicured lawn, a jarring sight on the quiet street. Inside, they began the painstaking process of documentation, photographs from every angle, detailed measurements, the careful collection of potential evidence. The victim, Linda Perry, was 53 years old. Her life, pieced together from initial inquiries, appeared stable and unremarkable from the outside. She worked as an office manager at a local firm, known for her reliability and quiet efficiency. She had been married to her husband, Thomas Perry, for over 30 years. They had no children. Their life in Guilderland seemed to embody the suburban ideal, quiet, private, routine. Thomas Perry was contacted and informed of his wife's death. His reaction, relayed later by investigators, was one of shock and disbelief. He was on a business trip several states away, providing an immediate, verifiable alibi for the time the death was believed to have occurred. This fact shifted the focus of the initial inquiry, away from the obvious suspect, the spouse. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment at the scene provided crucial, albeit limited, information. There were no obvious signs of trauma that would immediately explain the death, such as gunshot wounds or stab wounds. This initially suggested a potential medical event, but the circumstances of the discovery and the lack of response from Linda Perry for 3 days raised immediate suspicion. The body's position and the state of the scene were meticulously documented, awaiting a full autopsy. The quiet neighborhood of Rosemont Drive was now the center of unwanted attention. Neighbors, initially hesitant, began to speak to investigators, offering glimpses into Linda Perry's life and the dynamics of the street. They described her as pleasant, reserved, someone who kept to herself but was always polite. The Perry house was seen as quiet, the couple rarely hosting large gatherings. The most frequent interaction neighbors observed was with the man who lived next door, Charles Davis. Mr. Davis was 71, a retired widower who had lived on Rosemont Drive for decades. He was known for being friendly, often seen working in his yard or sitting on his front porch. Neighbors described a seemingly cordial relationship between Linda Perry and Charles Davis, noting that she would sometimes be seen chatting with him over the shared property line or helping him with small tasks. There was nothing in these early observations to suggest anything beyond neighborly pleasantness. The investigation branched out. Detectives reviewed Linda Perry's professional life, speaking with colleagues and her employer. They examined her phone records and computer activity, searching for any clues about her recent state of mind, her contacts, or anything unusual. This phase was a deep dive into the mundane details of her existence, searching for the anomaly that could explain the violent end to her life. The house remained a frozen tableau, crime scene tape stark against the autumnal colors. Each object, each detail within its walls was a potential piece of evidence, waiting to be discovered and interpreted. The quiet peace of Rosemont Drive was irrevocably broken, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty, and the silent, systematic work of investigators trying to understand how death had arrived so unexpectedly, so quietly, in a place that felt so safe. The lack of obvious signs of struggle or forced entry continued to puzzle investigators, suggesting a crime committed by someone known to the victim, or under circumstances that prevented resistance. This question hung heavy in the air, a silent challenge to the methodical work underway. The initial phase of forensic analysis focused on processing the crime scene inside the house. Fingerprints were lifted from surfaces, samples collected from potential points of entry, and the general layout and condition of the house documented in minute detail. The lack of disorder remained a striking feature. Drawers were not rummaged through, valuables appeared untouched. This reinforced the theory that the motive was not robbery. The medical examiner's office began the autopsy on Linda Perry. This procedure was critical to determine the precise cause and manner of death, information that had been elusive at the scene. The internal examination would potentially reveal hidden injuries or other factors that could explain her passing. The results of the autopsy were awaited with urgency, as they would significantly direct the course of the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives continued to canvass the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual in the days leading up to the discovery. They were looking for any deviation from the neighborhood's quiet routine, strange vehicles, noises, or individuals. The timeline of Linda Perry's last known activities was meticulously reconstructed. She had last been seen or heard from on Tuesday afternoon. The discovery was made on Friday afternoon. This established a potential window of time during which her death occurred, a period of approximately 3 days. Thomas Perry provided details of his business trip, including flight information, hotel stays, and meetings, all of which were being independently verified by investigators. His alibi appeared solid for the established time frame of death. Attention naturally turned to those closest to Linda, who were geographically present. Neighbors were interviewed again, more formally this time. Their initial statements about Linda being quiet and friendly were consistent. Charles Davis, the next-door neighbor, was among those interviewed early on. He confirmed his neighborly interactions with Linda, stating he hadn't seen her since Tuesday. He appeared cooperative, expressing sadness at the news of her passing. He was a seemingly gentle older man, his demeanor calm during the initial conversation. Detectives asked routine questions about his activities over the past few days. He provided a simple account of his days, largely spent at home. His house, next door, also appeared neat and well-maintained, similar in style to Linda Perry's. The close proximity of the two houses meant that any activity at one could potentially be observed from the other, making the relationship between the residents particularly relevant. The lack of forced entry into Linda Perry's house suggested she had either let her killer in, or the killer possessed a key. If she let them in, it implied a level of trust or familiarity. If they had a key, it raised questions about how they obtained it. These were critical pathways for the investigation to explore. The seemingly peaceful suburban setting of Rosemont Drive began to feel less like a haven and more like a stage where a hidden drama had reached a violent conclusion. The initial mystery of how Linda Perry died, and why in her own home without a sign of struggle, was compounded by the absence of an obvious perpetrator or motive, leaving investigators searching for the invisible cracks in the seemingly perfect picture of suburban life. The methodical collection of evidence continued, each sample taken from the scene holding the potential to rewrite the narrative of Linda Perry's final moments. The autopsy results arrived, providing the first definitive answers and dramatically changing the direction of the investigation. Linda Perry's death was not due to natural causes. The medical examiner determined she had been asphyxiated, suffocated. There were signs consistent with manual strangulation, but also indications of suffocation by other means, suggesting a complex, possibly prolonged assault. The time of death was estimated to be sometime on Tuesday, consistent with when she was last seen or heard from. The autopsy also revealed unexpected findings. There was evidence of recent sexual activity. This finding was particularly jarring given the initial assumption of a quiet, conventional life and marriage. It immediately raised questions about the nature of Linda Perry's relationships outside of her marriage. Coupled with the lack of forced entry, the presence of sexual activity suggested the victim likely knew her assailant and had potentially engaged in consensual activity before the fatal assault, or had been incapacitated quickly. This revelation shifted the focus from a random attack to a crime of passion or an encounter gone terribly wrong. The investigation pivoted sharply. The quiet narrative of Linda Perry's life was now layered with complexity. Detectives began to explore potential relationships she might have been involved in, scrutinizing her communications and activities with renewed intensity. The initial review of her phone and computer records had been standard procedure, but now they were scoured for any indication of a clandestine relationship. This search yielded results. There were numerous text messages and emails exchanged between Linda Perry and an unknown contact saved simply as C. The content of these messages was intimate, indicating a secret, ongoing affair. The frequency and tone suggested a relationship that had been active for some time. The identity of C became the immediate priority. Cross-referencing phone records revealed that the number belonged to Charles Davis, the 71-year-old neighbor. This discovery was stunning, shattering the image of a simple neighborly relationship. The quiet man next door, the friendly widower, was potentially involved in a secret romantic relationship with Linda Perry, a woman 30 years his junior and married. The realization that the affair was with the neighbor, living mere yards away, added a layer of psychological complexity to the case. It was a relationship hidden in plain sight on a quiet suburban street. The dynamic of their proximity, the potential for their secret to be discovered, introduced a potent motive for conflict. This was the first major narrative twist, a key piece of the puzzle found earlier in the investigation than might be typical, significantly accelerating the pacing and deepening the mystery. The discreet neighborly interactions observed by others now took on a completely different meaning, possibly veiled moments of connection or tension. The question now was not just who killed Linda Perry, but why, and how the secret affair with her elderly neighbor led to her violent death. This newfound information cast a shadow of suspicion over Charles Davis that was absolute and immediate, transforming him from a cooperative witness to the primary person of interest. The investigation into Charles Davis began in earnest, focusing on his background, his activities leading up to Linda's death, and his potential motive for murder. The discovery of the secret affair with Charles Davis became the central focus of the investigation. Detectives began a deeper dive into his life, his past, and his current circumstances. They learned he was a retired engineer, widowed several years prior. He had adult children, but they lived out of state. He appeared to live a quiet, solitary life, seemingly defined by his garden and his routine. His communications were examined, confirming the extensive exchange of intimate messages with Linda Perry. These messages painted a picture of a relationship that was emotionally involved and physically active. The timeline of the affair was pieced together, suggesting it had been ongoing for over a year. The texts and emails revealed a growing tension in the relationship in the weeks leading up to Linda's death. There were mentions of wanting different things, of one party wanting to end the affair while the other resisted.
This provided a potential motive. A dispute over the continuation or termination of the secret relationship could have escalated into violence. Specifically, messages suggested Linda Perry was attempting to distance herself, perhaps feeling guilt, or fearing to participate, or simply wanting to end the clandestine arrangement. Charles Davis's responses indicated increasing possessiveness and distress at the prospect of the affair ending. This introduced a second key twist, a significant narrative reveal within the midpoint of the investigation. The affair wasn't just happening, it was in crisis, providing a clear potential trigger for the homicide. Forensic analysis of the scene began to yield results that corroborated the connection to Davis. Trace evidence, meticulously collected, was analyzed in the state police lab. Samples taken from under Linda Perry's fingernails contained foreign biological material. Initial tests indicated it was male DNA. There was also trace evidence, potentially fibers or hairs, recovered from Linda Perry's clothing and body that did not belong to her or her husband. This evidence was sent for comparison to samples obtained from Charles Davis. The results were definitive. The male DNA found under Linda Perry's fingernails matched Charles Davis. Furthermore, trace fibers found on Linda Perry's clothing were consistent with fibers from items found in Charles Davis's home. This forensic evidence was powerful, placing Charles Davis in physical contact with Linda Perry at or near the time of her death, likely during a struggle. It contradicted his initial statement of not having seen her since Tuesday. The presence of his DNA under her fingernails strongly suggested she had fought back, perhaps scratching him, as she was being suffocated. This evidence, combined with the revealed nature of the affair and the escalating tension indicated in their communications, built a compelling case against Charles Davis. The seemingly quiet widower was now linked to the murder not just by motive and opportunity, but by irrefutable physical evidence. The discovery of the affair, and then the forensic link, arriving in quick succession, significantly accelerated the investigation, narrowing the focus almost exclusively on Charles Davis. The disparity between his public persona as a quiet, elderly neighbor and the private reality of a secret, tumultuous affair culminating in murder was stark and unsettling. The methodical collection and analysis of evidence had stripped away the facade, revealing the hidden life and the violent truth beneath the surface of Rosemont Drive. With the forensic evidence linking Charles Davis to the scene and victim, and the communications revealing the affair and its recent turmoil, law enforcement moved to apprehend him. Plainclothes detectives maintained surveillance on his house on Rosemont Drive. On a quiet Tuesday morning, a week after Linda Perry's body was discovered, Charles Davis was taken into custody. He was cooperative, almost passively so, when approached by officers. The arrest was executed without incident, a quiet removal of a neighbor from a street still grappling with the shock of the murder. Davis was transported to the Guilderland Police Department for questioning. Under interrogation, confronted with the evidence of the affair, the communications, and the DNA, Charles Davis eventually provided a statement. His account, while not a full confession in the immediate sense, corroborated key details and provided insight into his perspective. He admitted to the affair with Linda Perry, confirming its duration and intimate nature. He stated that Linda had recently told him she wanted to end the relationship. He claimed to have gone over to her house on Tuesday afternoon to talk about it, hoping to convince her to change her mind. He described their conversation becoming heated. He stated that he became upset, overwhelmed by the prospect of losing her. His description of the moments leading to her death was less clear, framed in terms of losing control, a moment of panic. He denied intending to kill her, but acknowledged his actions had caused her death. This statement, carefully documented, provided the narrative framework for the prosecution. It aligned with the forensic evidence of asphyxiation during a close physical struggle and the motive suggested by the communications. The fact that she had let him into her home, as indicated by the lack of forced entry, was consistent with his account of going over to talk. The tension revealed in the messages had apparently boiled over into fatal violence.
The community on Rosemont Drive struggled to comprehend the reality of what had occurred. The man they knew as a quiet, friendly neighbor was now revealed as a participant in a secret affair that had ended in murder. The trust and safety of the street were shattered. The investigation continued to gather additional corroborating evidence. Cell phone tower data confirming Davis's phone was at his home, adjacent to Linda Perry's, during the estimated time of death. Witness statements placing both Linda and Charles at their respective homes on Tuesday. A search warrant was executed at Charles Davis's residence, Investigators meticulously searched his home for any further evidence, communications, personal items, anything that could shed more light on the affair or the events of that Tuesday. While the primary evidence had already been secured, the search was crucial for a complete picture. The quiet, unassuming house next door now held the secrets of a hidden life and a violent act. The contrast between the outward appearance of normalcy on Rosemont Drive and the hidden turmoil that had led to murder was a chilling realization for everyone connected to the case. The legal process against Charles Davis commenced. He was formally charged with murder. At his arraignment, he entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution began the lengthy process of building their case, compiling all the evidence. The forensic reports detailing asphyxiation and the DNA match, the extensive communications between Davis and Linda Perry outlining the affair and the escalating tension, witness statements, the scene photographs and Davis's own statements to police. The narrative presented by the prosecution was that of a secret affair gone tragically wrong. Linda Perry, wanting to end the relationship confronted by a possessive lover, resulted in a violent struggle in her own bedroom. The strangulation and suffocation were presented as deliberate acts, born of desperation and anger over the rejection. The defense faced a challenging task given the strength of the forensic and communication evidence. Their strategy appeared to focus on portraying the act as one committed in a moment of passion or panic, without premeditation, potentially arguing for a lesser charge like manslaughter. Court documents, though not fully public at this stage, outlined the prosecution's reliance on the timeline of the affair's deterioration as revealed through text messages and emails. These excerpts, presented neutrally through legal filings, highlighted the emotional pressure points leading up to the fatal encounter. For example, a message from Linda to Charles days before her death read, paraphrased in legal context, "I can't do this anymore. It's too much." A response from Charles, also paraphrased, "You can't leave me. Not now." These brief, impactful exchanges underscored the motive. The house on Rosemont Drive remained empty, a silent monument to the tragedy. The yellow tape had been removed, but the visual memory lingered, a constant reminder for the neighbors of what had happened. The quiet street now felt different, tainted by the knowledge of the hidden life and the violence it had spawned. The community, once a picture of quiet suburban life, was forced to confront the reality that secrets could be harbored anywhere, even next door. The pretrial phase involved numerous hearings, motions filed by both the prosecution and the defense, and the complex process of discovery where evidence was shared. The sheer volume of digital evidence, the thousands of texts and emails exchanged over the year-long affair, required meticulous organization and presentation. Each message was a potential piece of the puzzle, revealing the evolving dynamic between Linda Perry and Charles Davis, from initial clandestine excitement to the final desperate exchanges. The age difference, the proximity, the marital status of one party, the widower status of the other, all these factors contributed to the intense secrecy that defined the relationship, and perhaps the desperation that led to its violent conclusion. The case moved slowly through the judicial system, the pace dictated by legal procedures and the complexity of the evidence. Each step forward brought the details of the affair and the murder back into public consciousness, a painful process for all involved. The silence of the Perry house was now matched by a different kind of silence, the hushed conversations and uneasy glances exchanged by neighbors on Rosemont Drive, the quiet devastation that had settled over their once peaceful street. As the case progressed towards trial, more specific details about the affair and the individuals involved emerged through court filings and pretrial hearings. The extent of the relationship between Linda Perry and Charles Davis was significant, far beyond casual interaction. It was a relationship conducted with extreme caution, involving burner phones or encrypted messaging apps, initially suggesting a mutual agreement on secrecy. However, the later messages showed a divergence, with Linda becoming increasingly anxious about discovery, and Charles becoming more emotionally dependent and resistant to ending the affair. Witness statements from a few close friends of Linda, presented in deposition summaries, revealed she had confided in them about the affair in the weeks leading up to her death, expressing stress and a desire to break it off. These confidences, offered with emotional understatement and legal transcripts, provided crucial third-party corroboration of the motive. One friend, identified in court documents as Sarah Chen, stated simply, "She said she was afraid. Not of him hurting her, but of everything coming out. Of hurting her husband." This quote, brief yet poignant, highlighted Linda's internal conflict and potential fears. Meanwhile, Charles Davis's background revealed no prior history of violence, which his defense would likely leverage to support the idea of an impulsive act rather than premeditated murder. He was known as a quiet, intelligent man, his life seemingly dedicated to routine and solitude after his wife's death. The contrast between this public image and the revealed private reality of the passionate, ultimately violent affair was central to the case's disturbing nature. The forensic evidence underwent further scrutiny. The DNA match was confirmed with high certainty. The trace fiber analysis provided further support for a physical interaction between Davis and Perry in a non-neutral context. Experts were prepared by both sides to testify on the specifics of the asphyxiation, the estimated time of death based on factors like rigor mortis and body temperature, and the interpretation of the trace evidence. The defense explored alternative theories during pretrial phases, questioning whether the sexual activity was consensual and whether someone else could have been involved. However, the totality of the evidence, the lack of forced entry, Davis's DNA under her fingernails, the specific messages detailing their conflict, and Davis's own statement placing him at the scene, significantly weakened any attempts to introduce a third party. The methodical police investigation had built a comprehensive case, brick by brick, detail by detail. The quiet precision of the forensic analysis and the patience sifting through digital communications had unearthed a hidden life and brought a perpetrator to light. The legal proceedings brought these private details into the public realm, further eroding the sense of privacy and security on Rosemont Drive. The approaching trial date loomed, promising to expose the full, unvarnished truth of the secret affair and its tragic conclusion, forcing the community and the families involved to relive the devastating events. The stillness of the Perry house remained, a physical representation of the life extinguished, while the legal battle over the details of her death moved forward. The trial of Charles Davis commenced in the Albany County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled with family members, neighbors, and members of the press. The prosecution presented their case methodically, starting with the discovery of Linda Perry's body and the initial puzzling scene. They detailed the forensic findings, presenting the medical examiner's testimony on the cause of death, asphyxiation by manual strangulation, and possibly other means, and the estimated time of death. They then introduced the crucial DNA evidence found under Linda Perry's fingernails, explaining the process of collection and analysis, and stating unequivocally that it matched Charles Davis. This was a powerful piece of evidence, visually presented through charts and expert testimony. The prosecution then shifted to the motive, presenting excerpts from the text messages and emails between Linda Perry and Charles Davis. A detective, specializing in digital forensics, walked the jury through the timeline of the affair as revealed by the communications, culminating in the messages from Linda expressing her desire to end the relationship and Charles's increasingly desperate replies. These messages, displayed on screens, brought the private, hidden aspect of their relationship into the stark public light of the courtroom. "I just need space," Charles, one text from Linda read. "Space? You mean you're leaving me?" "After everything," was Charles's reply from days later. This sequence of communications provided a clear narrative of the tension leading to the fatal encounter. Witnesses were called, including the neighbor who discovered the body, the initial responding officers, crime scene analysts, and the medical examiner. Linda Perry's friends testified about her recent stress and her intentions to end the affair, their voices quiet but firm as they recounted her confidences. Thomas Perry, Linda's husband, also testified. His presence in the courtroom was a somber reminder of the life irrevocably altered. His testimony was brief, recounting his last interactions with Linda, his business trip, and the shock of learning of her death. His grief was palpable but restrained, matching the overall tone of the proceedings. The defense cross-examined witnesses, attempting to cast doubt on aspects of the forensic evidence or suggest alternative scenarios, but the prosecution's case was built on multiple layers of corroborating evidence. The sheer volume and intimacy of the communications, combined with the direct physical link provided by the DNA, created a formidable case. The defense's strategy seemed to pivot towards portraying Charles Davis as a lonely elderly man who acted impulsively in a moment of emotional distress, arguing for a lesser charge than first-degree murder, which would require proof of premeditation. Charles Davis did not testify. His statement to police, admitting to being at Linda's house and losing control, was a key piece of evidence for both sides, interpreted differently. The prosecution saw it as confirmation of his presence and actions, the defense as evidence of a lack of intent to kill. The quiet man, who had lived next door for decades, sat stoically, listening as the most intimate details of his hidden life and the most devastating moments of Linda Perry's end were laid bare in the public arena. The quiet devastation of Rosemont Drive had found its voice in the clinical presentation of evidence and testimony in the courtroom. The defense presented their case, focusing on Charles Davis's character as a peaceful elderly man with no history of violence. They called witnesses who knew him from the neighborhood or his retirement years, who spoke of his quiet nature and friendly demeanor. The aim was to create a contrast between the man portrayed by the prosecution, desperate, possessive, capable of fatal violence, and the man his neighbors knew. The defense suggested that while an altercation occurred, the death was not premeditated. They argued that the nature of the asphyxiation could be consistent with a struggle where panic took over, rather than a deliberate, sustained act of murder. They questioned the exact timeline and nuances of the communication leading up to the death, suggesting that the interpretation of the messages as a clear indication of Linda definitively ending the affair and Charles reacting with murderous intent was an oversimplification. However, the defense struggled to overcome the weight of the forensic evidence. The DNA under Linda Perry's fingernails was a powerful indicator that she had physically resisted her attacker, suggesting a struggle for life, not a passive or accidental death. The prosecution effectively countered the defense's character witnesses by highlighting the discrepancy between Davis's public persona and the clandestine, intense nature of the affair revealed through the communications. They argued that his quiet exterior hid a depth of emotion and possessiveness that surfaced violently when he faced rejection. Closing arguments were delivered with gravity. The prosecution reiterated their narrative: a secret affair, a planned breakup, an emotional confrontation that escalated to murder, supported by the forensic proof of Davis's presence in a struggle, and the clear motive shown in the messages. They asked the jury to consider the clinical evidence of how Linda Perry died, the forceful, deliberate act of asphyxiation, as proof of intent. The defense urged the jury to consider the possibility of an act committed in the heat of passion, a tragic accident born of emotional turmoil, not a planned killing. They asked the jury to look beyond the sensational nature of the affair and consider the character of the man on trial and the possibility that the situation tragically spiraled out of control. The jury deliberated. The weight was tense for all involved. The future of Charles Davis hung in the balance, as did the community's ability to begin to heal from the shock and devastation. The quiet street of Rosemont Drive felt a world away from the sterile intensity of the courtroom, yet the fate decided within those walls would forever mark the lives of those who remained on the street, and the memory of the woman who had lived and died there. The meticulous process of presenting evidence and arguments had brought the hidden secrets into the open, but the final interpretation, the judgment on the nature of the act, rested with the jury. The quiet hum of the courtroom air conditioning filled the silence as the world waited for the verdict. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Charles Davis was found guilty of murder. The specific degree of murder determined by the jury reflected their interpretation of the evidence, finding that the act was not simply a moment of panic, but carried the intent required for the murder conviction. The verdict sent a wave of quiet, somber relief through the courtroom for Linda Perry's family and friends, while Charles Davis remained stoic, his expression unreadable. The formal reading of the verdict marked the legal conclusion to the case, the definitive judgment on the events that had transpired in the quiet house on Rosemont Drive. Sentencing followed weeks later. The court considered the circumstances of the crime, Charles Davis's age, and the impact on the victim's family and the community. Victim impact statements were read, offering a glimpse into the pain and loss caused by Linda Perry's death. Her husband Thomas Perry spoke with quiet dignity about his wife, their life together, and the devastation of her absence. The judge handed down a sentence commensurate with the severity of the crime, ensuring that Charles Davis would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The legal proceedings had dissected the affair, the motive, and the mechanics of the death, bringing a form of closure through judicial process. But the emotional and human toll lingered. Linda Perry's life, seemingly ordinary from the outside, was cut short by a secret relationship that turned deadly.
The affair with her elderly neighbor, hidden beneath a veneer of suburban respectability, led to a violent end that no one on Rosemont Drive could have ever predicted. The quiet house where she died stood as a silent witness to the hidden turmoil that existed just beneath the surface of everyday life. The neighborhood itself had been irrevocably changed. The ease and trust that once characterized Rosemont Drive were replaced by a lingering unease, a stark awareness of the secrets that neighbors might keep. The story of Linda Perry and Charles Davis became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that hidden lives can have devastating consequences. The methodical nature of the investigation, the clinical presentation of forensic evidence, and the objective reporting of communications had laid bare the facts, but they could not fully capture the human dimension of the tragedy, the betrayal felt by a husband, the loss suffered by friends and family, the shock endured by a community. The quiet devastation that had begun with neglected mail on a porch had unfolded into a public spectacle of a hidden life and a violent death. The legacy of the events on Rosemont Drive was one of shattered innocence and a haunting reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary and devastating secrets can exist, with tragic and permanent consequences. The silence that now surrounds the house at number 17 Rosemont Drive is not just the absence of noise, but the heavy quiet of a life ended too soon, and the enduring impact of a secret revealed in the most brutal way imaginable. The neatly trimmed hedges and quiet street lights now seem to guard not just property, but the memory of a hidden tragedy that forever altered the landscape of their quiet corner of Guilderland, New York.